Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. My name is Isaiah and I will be your guide today as we go down a Death Note spiral that started yesterday and continues on in my thoughts. I don't even know how relevant Death Note is to today's youth, but when I was growing up, it was majorly important to me. I even still have somewhere on Facebook, one of my old icons was the picture of Elle looking thoughtful, and it says, Jesus loves you, because I was that sort of Christian. Um, I wasn't really allowed to watch Death Note or read manga in general as a kid, so most of my experience was through illicit means, either reading the manga in the library on poorly translated scans in the morning before classes, or my friend telling me about BB and the whole story from before the manga even started. And I was obsessed. I loved the symbolism. I loved the story. I loved Elle. I loved the ending, and not many people do. Admittedly, the ending isn't that great, but I loved Nier. I loved Mello, and I always felt so sad that we couldn't see more of Matt, especially in the anime. But I never really got to watch the full thing until I was in college, and I probably watched it on some illegal site that just had everything downloaded, and yeah, so only since Netflix has started airing Death Note have I been able to watch it legally, and I do so every few years apparently, according to my history. Um, but this most recent watch from yesterday has me thinking about Death Note more critically, and I guess over the years I've been thinking about the fandom around it and the actual anime more and more critically, starting with the fandom being so obsessed with Light and wanting to side with him and make him out to be the good guy, and it's just like no. And then my love of Elle started to sour as I started to realize that he actually wasn't that great of a person either. I admit that Nier's not much better either, but I do still love him. I'm sorry. I have a love for cold-faced boys who have white hair apparently. So when I was watching it this time, I was sort of like, well, what's going on here? Why am I not rooting for anybody now? Why am I seeing like the ugliness of it all? And that's what I wanted to talk about a bit today. So, I will say there's going to be spoilers throughout if you've somehow not watched Death Note, but you're watching this. Be warned, everything's going to be spoiled. And I also want to give the disclaimer of I am aware that this is a Japanese franchise. It was written by a Japanese author. It is directed primarily towards Japanese culture, but I am an American. I am looking at this through a Western lens. I am looking at this from a US centric lens. And I feel like this is a valid point of critique, not saying that anything that the author has done is necessarily bad, but this is how I'm interpreting it at this current time with my current lens, and I feel like it's valid because it has gotten such a large reception. It's one of the greats, one of the anime that most people recommend new anime watchers to watch in the Western world, to the point where there was an American adaptation of Death Note that sucked, but just want to put that out there. If you want to discuss with me how Death Note reflects Japanese culture at the time it was written, I would love to go through that with you in the comments. I'd love to learn, and if there was enough of a discussion, I would love to be able to make a video about it discussing the original meaning behind Death Note. But this is Death of the Author, and this is a look at the culture that we're looking at through an American lens. So, that disclaimer's out of the way. Let's get into it. And let's start with the actual story. We have Light Yagami, who finds a death note, a notebook that literally brings death to whoever's name is written in it, and he decides what he wants to do is kill criminals. That's very noble of him, especially because he starts off with focusing on criminals who have horrible, horrible crimes against them, whose backgrounds don't justify it, all that sort of stuff. There's a mention in there that he noticed one of his other Kiras were killing off people who didn't really have the MO that Kira did. Like, they were robbing places that when they were needing food or money to get by, that sort of thing. So the anime makes it very clear that Light, at least at the start, is trying to do things for noble reasons. I mean, he's the son of a police officer. He's seen how everything goes. He's very intelligent. He's solved cases in the past. So this boy be in the know. And that's why I think it's a valid criticism of the police force, because Kira and Light are operating initially from the side of this is justice, this is the police justice, this is what needs to be done that the police necessarily can't do. So it's a bit of police brutality, if you want to make a stretch, but at least that's where the ideology starts, is from the police force. And then we look at the Japanese Kira task force that's headed by L. At some point, the Japanese police stop involving themselves with the Kira case. They're like, okay, we can't handle this. We're going to back down so that we don't start being killed. Because at this point, Light has already become corrupted. Like, he was corrupted from the beginning. Like, he didn't so much as slip down into criminality and evilness so much as he ran towards it with a sled, as Breyer puts it. But he's further corrupted. He's already killed the FBI agents, and he is willing to kill other people. And his second Kira has also killed TV hosts that were shady, but not necessarily as criminal as the criminals like tended to go for. So the police force backed down, and we have several members quit the police force to continue on the Kira case. And then they kidnap Misa Amane, who is, admittedly, she's the second Kira, but they didn't have any hard proof of that. The most that they had was some hair and fingerprint samples from the videos that she sent in, which is not enough to convict someone to a full bodysuit, blindfolded, and utterly restrained while in a vertical position. Like, that poor girl probably went through some muscle atrophy at the very least, because she was locked up for almost 2 months, I believe. And that is definitely something that gave me pause this time watching it. The treatment of Misa Amane throughout the manga and the anime is already atrocious. The treatment of any woman in the anime particularly is horrible, because you have Misa, who starts off being at least somewhat clever, somewhat near Light's intelligence, but quickly devolves to the point where she's jealously and drunkenly trying to have a standoff with one of Light's other female friends that he's also using. You have Sayu, who ends up being utterly traumatized so that the plot can progress. You have Takano, who is a very intelligent woman that Light met in college, and he notices that she's very vain, and then she ends up being killed because she served her purpose to Light, because she was obsessed with Kira. And on and on and on. There's not a whole lot of female characters. I mean, there's also Naomi, who's very intelligent, but she ends up giving her driver's license over to Light, and he's able to make her commit suicide. And that's after she had been sidelined from the FBI by her fiance. Women aren't treated well, is what I'm trying to say. And that's always rubbed me the wrong way, especially Misa. I love Misa. But we're not focusing on that. Right now we're focusing on the fact that they kidnapped and bodily restrained a young woman to the point where when she lost her memory, she thought she had a stalker and was begging for anything to help. She was even willing to put herself in extremely compromising positions to try and get some time to walk around or be free. And they do the same with Light. They restrain him. They restrain his ankles and his hands for some reason for 2 months, despite the fact he's in a cell um, and on 24-hour watch. And all of this is while they're like outside of the police force, more or less, which is incredibly disturbing. There is this point of L is getting desperate, so he's trying to do whatever he can to prove his theory, but it doesn't justify why everyone else is willing to go along with it. Like everyone besides L, who is a police informant, not informant, a consultant, a police consultant. Everyone else was a police officer. So that's a lot. And you continue on, and the same thing with the American team later on. Near is totally fine with most of his team being killed when Mello gets the death note. He didn't really make any strong attempt to stop it. He just kind of let it happen to try and prove a point to Light, who is operating as the second L. And that leads me into another point, which is the fact that Death Note thinks that only a select few people can make a difference. And these Ubermen, which is completely in contrast of what we're seeing today with BLM riots happening and the fact that people are no longer working because after the main part of the pandemic, and especially the US people weren't taken care of, they're not wanting to go back to work to horrible jobs that just sap us of energy and strength and don't really pay us properly in turn. So we have what's actually happening in the world, but in Death Note, you have Light, who is manipulating everyone around him, including the other Kiras, and then you have L, who is manipulating everyone around him, especially the police officers. And later on, you have Near, who is manipulating everyone around him, including another Uberman, Mello, whose flaw is that he chooses to go with criminality explicitly instead of being like Near, who just kind of implicitly lets it happen. And it doesn't matter what anyone else does. Like, my favorite characters are Aizawa and Matsuda. They are two people from the Japanese task force. Aizawa being someone who has a kid and has family and he cares about them greatly. He actually leaves the task force when it comes time to resign or continue being a police officer because he needs to take care of his kids. And L manipulates the fuck out of him because L doesn't say he's willing to help cover expenses and pay until after Aizawa's like, I can't do this. I have to take care of my family. And then L even continues to have the last word, and it's played off as a joke, but it's really gross. Aizawa ends up coming back. He brings the police force back in temporarily and then starts working with the task force once more. Though I think he is more or less had to resign from the police at the time because the police still weren't really going to fight against Kira. And then you have Matsuda, who is played off as a joke. He's another one of my favorite characters. He ends up being the one to take care of Misa's PR. And at the very end, he is the one that ends up shooting Light several times and tries to kill him because his faith in Light has been so severely broken. And Matsuda is someone else who's very easily manipulated. And these are two characters that could have made a huge difference if this was any other sort of anime. But because we are supposed to only focus on the Ubermen, all they get to do are play small, minute roles. Like Matsuda's always the joke. Aizawa has a little bit more to do, but at the end of the day, he's just as manipulated by Near as anyone else. And let's talk about that ending. A lot of people hate the second season of Death Note, and I can understand why. In contrast to the first season, which focuses mostly on Light and L's fight and confrontation and little details that lead up into a big reveal, the second half of Death Note tries to do that, but everything's so much more compressed that it doesn't really work. We end up getting told more of the stuff than what we felt like we were being told in the first half. Though, I will say, the whole reveal of how Light is able to give up the Death Note and then regain his memories is just as much told to us as later when Nier reveals how he was able to swap out the Death Note for a fake one. And I people react to it differently because there's a lot less that we get to see in the second half, I believe. There's a lot more interest set up because then we have two mini L's with between Mello and Nier coming at Kira from two different angles, but it's over so quickly it's disappointing, if that makes sense. And the actual ending where all the criminals are killed doesn't feel very realistic. The one part I do like is when Kira is called out, when Light is called out. He has an absolute breakdown and Matsuda snaps. And this is why Matsuda is my favorite character. He starts shooting at Light. He keeps him from using this little scrap of the Death Note that he's had hidden in his watch for a very long time since he was first going to give up the Death Note. That's how he was able to go through it. And I appreciate that buildup. It's Chekhov's watch, basically. Light's watch. But Matsuda loses his shit. He's just like, he's been led on for so many years at this point by Light. And it's a sad moment. And I like how the anime showed it up until X Kira, who was the current holder of the notebook, tries to commit suicide. And that's overly dramatic. And the camera shakes and it breaks it for me. I liked the manga because it's quiet. Light gets away, but he's going to die. And Ryuk, his Shinigami that's been with him from the beginning, writes his name in the notebook, and it's a quiet moment, and he dies. It's like the great big bad just dies with a whimper instead of a bang. But because of the whole crazy suicide thing, it feels very different. And the way that the anime ends it with him being able to look into the light feels different. But that moment when Matsuda snaps is my favorite part. But looking at this entire anime as a whole in a post-BLM light, it feels very different because there's a focus on the good being the law enforcement. And nowadays we know that just isn't true. Mello dies, Matt dies, everyone dies in the criminal organization that's also trying to fight because they've been corrupted by the Death Note. Light dies because he's been corrupted by the Death Note. L dies because he was willing to break the laws and he still was able to get nowhere. At the end of the day, it's the law enforcement that gets things done, and it's these very select few within law enforcement that gets things done. There's no police corruption, not really. Light was stealing information from his dad before he was officially in the police force. I don't think Light ever officially became a police officer, so the corruption was always external. And we just know that isn't true these days. So the question is Death Note relevant in today's world? I think it is. I think it's a good look at what we used to think would be the future. I think it's a good look on how that you can incorporate Christian symbology just like most people will incorporate other mythologies into their work. without it necessarily being just pretty like Neon Genesis Evangelion using Christian symbology, but just because it looked cool. Yeah, it's a lot overt. It is a lot overt in Death Note what they use as Christian symbology, but I still think it's a good look. I think it's a good story for the most part. And it's okay if it's not for everyone. I'm starting to think it's not really for me anymore either, but I'm still going to watch it in the future for nostalgia's sake. But I do think it's a good look on what we wish the police force could be, what we wish could be true of a few good men being able to make things happen against one bad man. But I don't think it's as poignant a take on society as we wish it would be. So it's a good fantasy. It's a good way to shut off your brain for a couple hours. But I don't think it's as big a deal as we used to make it out to be when I was a kid. And that's all I've got for today. Hope everyone stays hydrated. Have a good day. I'll see y'all tomorrow.